Welcome back. I must apologise for the longer than anticipated delay. It seems that not only has our own live streaming gone down, but a large chunk of the internet has been disabled for whatever reason in the last half an hour or so. So we're back live. I'm going to hand over to our Chief Executive, James Calder, to present his report and an outline of his strategy for the next 5 years. James.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. I'm just going to share some slides, so bear with me 1 second. There we go. Right, as Ian kind of referred to, we do think at this particular point in time, half of the internet is down. Everything that Fastly hosts, which is Reddit, Twitch, The Guardian, the BBC, government.uk website is down. So I hope however many of you are in the room are actually able to watch this and are still with us. But if not, this will go out after the fact as a recording. But an extraordinary day, possibly the worst day for that to happen for SIBA. So first thing I want to say, getting back into the swing of my presentation, as it were, is a big thank you to Ian Fozzard for his tenure as chairman. Having a steady, experienced pair of hands on the tiller has certainly been beneficial to me over the past 2 years. The chairman position is unremunerated. It is a volunteer position, and suffice it to say, Ian has put a huge amount of time, effort, blood, sweat, tears, and above all else, hours into the last 2 years. So a big thank you from me to Ian, and look forward to whoever succeeds you tomorrow at tomorrow's board meeting. Looking back 1 year ago, where we were in Liverpool, there we are at BRX. Our last AGM, BRX was the last kind of big event, main event that the industry had. It was pretty much touch and go as to whether or not that would go ahead, given the imminent government guidelines and the imminent lockdown that we had very, very shortly after, the guidance around large-scale events. But if sat there I am, if I was going to be able to predict where I was then as to what had happened over the preceding or the next 15 months, I think we all would have been amazed. It's certainly been a year from hell, and it's certainly one that we're all going to remember and not forget anytime soon. A couple of reflections from me in terms of what happened over the pandemic, some things that went well, some things that SIBA did well, and some things that didn't go quite so well for us. One of the things that I've been most sort of amazed by is the overall resilience of the sector, both from a financial perspective and from a kind of morale perspective. I, at the beginning of this pandemic, thought many more breweries were going to go out of business than actually have done. It's only been a handful, and whilst that is sad, very, very sad for that handful, the rest of the sector just seems to have been much more resilient than any of us would have thought. On a personal level, lots of us have gone through incredible hardship over the last year, and my heart does go out to all of those people, everybody really in the brewing industry. But again, I think on the whole, I don't want to demean particular experiences, but we're a tough bunch, and we've managed to get through this as best we can. Small pack sales has obviously been something that's been hugely important over the last 15 months. I really do hope that small pack sales continue to be a big part of, if you've got a canning line or a bottling line, I do hope that they continue to be a big part of your businesses. I think there's been a bit of a renaissance or an awakening over the past 15 months that the margin that you're able to derive and able to control from small pack sales has been something that we all want to hang on to. And I personally have been very thankful for all the beer that I've been buying, and some of you have been sort of gracious enough to send our way over the past year. So a big thank you. Takeaway sales for pubs and breweries, whilst a small, and you could describe it as a kind of parochial thing almost, SIBA was at the forefront of arguing for those 2 successive last lockdowns in November that breweries and pubs should be allowed to do takeaway sales. It was only ever going to be a tiny percentage of making up for overall volumes of trade, but it was a principal point, and it was one that we fought very, very hard on. So I'm proud of that. We did manage to secure £1.8 million worth of financial support for breweries in Scotland, and I'll talk about the rest of the country in a second. But that Brewers Support Fund in Scotland gave up to £30,000 to each brewery. We know, and we've consistently made the case over the last year, that financial support has been woeful, it's been patchy, that discretionary support simply wasn't adequate. But in Scotland, we did manage to secure that, and we then tried to use that as a bit of a stick to hit the rest of Westminster, Cardiff and Northern Ireland governments with, but we weren't successful, unfortunately. As Ian kind of referred to earlier, the comms that SIBA were putting out, we've invested a huge amount of time and energy in those over the past year, and I hope everybody listening has found those useful. In a landscape that was changing so rapidly, the restrictions that were in place, what you were allowed to do, what you weren't allowed to do, as well as communicating what SIBA was doing to try and change that. I took the decision at the beginning of this pandemic that every single brewery in the land should have the right to the best possible information, regardless if you were a SIBA member or not, enabling as many of you as possible to get through this as best you can. So again, I hope those comms that we've been putting out in my name across our various different channels you found helpful, but not all me. In fact, a small part of it was me. Big thank you to Neil and Barry, who are on this call as well, for all of your hard work in ensuring that you guys out there have had the best possible information. A couple of quick statistics for you. So furlough has obviously been hugely important to lots of sectors of the economy. We reckon about 87% of brewers used it. Interestingly, the smaller you get as a brewery, the less likely you were to use furlough. We think that's partly as a result of director owners not taking a salary and taking drawdown instead, but nevertheless an interesting stat. On average, we think in 2020 production fell by about 34%. Those were figures that we derived from a survey that we did in January, but the production figures that you've been sending us over the past couple of weeks to calculate your membership subs, we think that figure's somewhere between 25 and 34%, but nevertheless, nearly 200 million pints fewer craft independent beer was brewed in 2020 as opposed to 2019. Hugely damaging year for all of us. Another couple of quick statistics, and this goes to the sort of resilience point and the adaptation point. The number of breweries that had an on-site shop jumped from 37% up to 60% last year, just showing how important those small pack sales are. So again, I hope that that's something that stays, and I hope that we begin to emulate and understand what is happening more in the United States with their kind of taproom culture, regeneration of local communities, all of that kind of stuff. Very, very important. There's some things that we didn't do as well as perhaps we would have liked for various different mitigating circumstances. As I referred to earlier, the financial support that's been available from local authorities has been patchy, it's been inconsistent, and it's been more than anything else unfair. And it's a great source of, I have to sort of apologise as Chief Executive of SIBA that we weren't able to secure what we secured in Scotland for the rest of the country, despite our best efforts with Treasury, with Number 10 and those government departments. Somebody in government got in their head that if they were to give direct financial support to breweries, then they would have to extend that out to other bits of the kind of manufacturing sector, but as Scotland proved, that wasn't true. But I think I've made my point there. Trade expectations around spoiled beer have been particularly, again, a source of hardship for nearly all of us. The idea that you had to pay for beer or offer credit or offer a replacement, not once, but twice in some cases, or thrice in some cases, is there. From a SIBA perspective, the messages that we were putting out into trade and what we were saying to pub companies was, please don't expect the same kinds of things from small brewers as you would from the globals. They have deeper pockets. They're able to replace beer, or in some cases reguile or rebadge beer that have been sat out in yards for a very long time. Small brewers might be able to, but please don't expect the same kind of thing. And I'm very, very conscious of that kind of pain that you've all felt over the last year or so. Hospitality has been scapegoated, of course. We've always been at the brunt of the most ridiculous, the strangest restrictions in some cases that have been unjustified, unscientific. We've all seen the long telephoto lens shots of busy high streets and outside busy pubs over the last year, and they haven't been helpful. We do have a real challenge on our hands to kind of rebuild public confidence that hospitality is a safe place to go as these restrictions now start to peel off, and fingers crossed, the majority of them will do so on June the 21st, at least in England, and then the rest of the UK. And a final point, I'm sure Kate Nichols from UK Hospitality will talk about this a little bit later. The government, more than anything else, have been unwilling to listen, despite our best intents. Some government departments have been very good, but others have not been so good. They've kind of put the blinkers on, and they've just pursued with one linear course of action and not appreciate a holistic kind of policy framework of the damage that's been done to lives, livelihoods by some of the restrictions that have been in place. So we got some things right, some things we didn't, and some things I would, if I had a time machine, I would go back and I would go and do differently. So we have some ongoing policy challenges as well. We obviously have the Small Brewers Relief Review that's due to report over the summer. We will be meeting with the Minister, we will be meeting with MPs, we will continue to push SIBA's, everybody should know SIBA's argument by now, and I won't go into repeating it. Over the summer, we should also have the results of the wider alcohol duty review, and as part of that, SIBA has been campaigning with other bodies for a cut in the draft beer duty rate, so a preferential rate for draft beer over small pack, with all of the restrictions that you should know about, and again are on our website. DRS is coming, not just in Scotland, but DRS is coming for the rest of the UK too. And Barry Watts, our Head of Public Affairs, is probably the most well-informed person on DRS and full extended producer responsibility of anybody within the UK. So please be aware of that. It is coming. Read up on it if you aren't also already. The other kind of policy challenge on the horizon is the obesity strategy, changes that are coming to labelling and the kinds of things that the anti-alcohol lobby are pushing for. So more important than ever that SIBA, as your trade association, is on top of all these policy issues now that we have a little bit of breathing space as restrictions from coronavirus start to peel off. And practical challenges too. Again, the reason I'm telling you these is just to make you aware that we are very much aware of the kinds of pain that you're going through and the worries that you have as brewers. What's the size of the market going to look like? You know, consumer behaviour has been changed inexorably over the past 15 months. People are now comfortable with brewing beer delivered to home, not going out to the pub, and we all need to be conscious of what the shape of the market will look like and what those consumer attitudes are doing. Recruitment, again, Kate may say a little bit about this in a couple of minutes' time, but recruitment, retention, training of quality staff all the way across the hospital, we're all aware of. There's more jobs now, I think, going in the brewing sector than there ever has been at any other point. Debt is something that, again, we at SIBA are also concerned about, as you might expect. That's from Crown Preference, so HMRC debts, BGT, VAT, but also those bounce back loans, those CBILS loans that are also going to start to come due in due course. We're on top of those things and we're cognizant of them. And of course, the ever-present threat of the globals. So thinking about all of those challenges combined, all of the things that we're thinking about and all the work that we've done over the past 15 months and a little bit more, we now think that the time is right to refresh SIBA's strategy so that we're in a better place to address some of those challenges, but also cognizant of the fact that SIBA is a small organisation. Now, given what happened with Stonegate, we have a smaller amount of resources to rely on. So we've got to be more fleet of foot than ever, more agile than ever, and continue to deliver on your priorities. So very, very briefly, or I'll do a quick skim through this. Also, be aware of the fact that this strategy is yet to be approved by SIBA's board, which is meeting tomorrow. So I'm giving you a kind of overview here rather than some of the detailed points underneath. Our vision for independent brewing from 2021 onwards is that the United Kingdom will have a vibrant, thriving and sustainable brewing industry. We want consumers to choose, so choose independent, and we want them to be able to choose, so they have that availability anywhere beer is sold. And critically, that beer should be conferred at a price that is fair to all, and fair first and foremost to brewers as the starting point in that supply chain. Our ambition, 3 points as part of this strategy, is that independent brewers' share of the market increases. I'm very cognizant of the fact that that is a big challenge, but nevertheless, we want your share of the market to increase to fight off that 88% that Phil and Pete were talking about earlier as part of that resolution. Secondly, we want the trading environment as a result of our activities and our campaigning to improve, to enable you to trade more profitably, or in some cases just profitably, given how difficult the past year has been. And our third ambition as part of this strategy is that SIBA will represent the majority of independent brewers in the UK by both individual number of breweries, but also by beer volumes. I just want to say a little bit about SIBA 1000 and Andy Parker from, everybody will know Tab Matau on Twitter. Thank you very much to those guys. It's my ambition also that SIBA gets to that 1,000 figure within the next 1 year, 2 years. We're going to invest a lot of time and a lot of energy in recruiting and spreading the word about what we do and what benefit we can provide to every brewery business within the UK. But nevertheless, it's all a big challenge. Our previous strategy had some pillars, and we've, over the past 6 months, taken a look at those pillars and tried to refine them and make them relevant for, as I said, the challenges that we are facing now as a result of COVID. So pillar number 1, we want to be able to create the conditions for brewers to grow market share. And as that resolution kind of got passed earlier this morning, that is about campaigning, but it's also about working directly with the on-trade too, and potentially the off-trade as well, subject to the discussion that we're going to be having at tomorrow's board. We need to evolve BeerFlex to make it work better for you and better for customers and provide that fairness all the way through. Our second pillar, therefore, is fairness, and that cuts across advocacy, lobbying, and within the sector itself. We need a fairer deal for brewers, and we need a fairer deal across all of those areas. And there'll be a number of projects underneath that try to secure that. Thirdly, we want to look across the pond. So our colleagues from the United States have their assured seal. Our seal is actually a little bit older. We introduced ours earlier, but we want consumers to be able to understand the importance of independence, why independent beer matters, why it is better, and choose it. You know, we need consumers to have a tool and a vehicle to be able to understand and recognize what is independent versus what is not, and get them to appreciate that. So look out for a big investment in the SIBA assured seal over the next 12 to 18 months. We want more brewers using it, we want more consumers to be aware of it, and we need to understand how it is working and how it lands with consumers a little bit better. Our fourth pillar as part of our strategy, and this is critical for any trade association, is we want to deliver value. We want to give you tools, guides, enhanced benefits, resources. We need to give you the training and the ability to help you run better businesses, both from a business perspective and a brewing perspective. So look out for more things like SIBA's labelling guide over the next year that will give you the knowledge that you need and give you a helping hand upwards to make your life just that little bit easier, because life is very, very difficult. Our fifth pillar is environmental sustainability. So that runs all the way through all of this. I'm passionate about sustainability, and I think brewers who use a lot of energy, a lot of water, and a lot of resources, we need to start thinking now about how we can reduce our impacts and our dependencies upon the natural world. And I'm very, very conscious of the fact that getting a business back up and running, getting it up off the ground has to be your priority number one. I completely agree with that. But as part of that, we also need to think about the longer term. We need to think about what the government may do to us as opposed to working with them. As we've seen with deposit return schemes, if the government get a head start on us, they will introduce things that will, if we had a blank sheet of paper, we wouldn't have been doing that ourselves, if that makes sense. There are 5 pillars. As I said, our board will be having a discussion about this tomorrow. We'll go into a little bit more detail and thrash all of this stuff out. But as it currently stands, that is an overview of where we are. I also just want to talk a little bit about our values, what SIBA believes in. So I'm looking at Ian for a kind of time check, as it were. 4 minutes to go. We believe in delivering for brewers. First and foremost, we all care about independent brewing. Everybody at SIBA is passionate about independent brewing, and we want to do the best that we can for all of you guys. That's value number 1. Secondly, we believe that independent beer is better beer. You know, that cuts through everything, surely. Thirdly, we believe in building community. So independent brewing itself is a community, but we also want to ensure that, you know, the independent brewing community itself is part where we are stronger if we work together, as it were. Sustainability, I've already talked about, but that cuts through as a value as well, and all of these values will be embedded in the team across SIBA as we go forward. Inclusivity, very, very important. You know, it goes to last night's Common Ground conference, which I was a part of. We believe that the independent brewing industry should be accessible and accepting to everyone, regardless of who you are. Very, very simple and very, very straightforward. We believe that quality should run through the heart of everything, so we'll be looking to enhance our FSQ and work with Seltzer over the next year or so too. Every pint of beer, every bottle of beer, every can of beer should be brewed and packaged and served to its absolute best. 7th, fairness. Fairness again has to run through everything, and that is one of our values too, and possibly the most important after the kind of divisive and difficult period that we've had over the last year or so. Working together is so important. We as an industry and we as a trade association are stronger if we work together. We want to unify the independent sector because it is independence that we can all agree upon, not drive the sector further apart. So there's a lot in that. 5 pillars, 4 values, some ambitions and some missions too. But as I said, tomorrow's board meeting will thrash this a little bit out, a little bit more, refine it and put some flesh on the bones, as it were, which is currently in progress. And in due course, you will all be seeing that over the coming weeks when we publish all of this stuff on the SIBA website. And I hope to see, well, you will be seeing the projects and things that go underneath, which will hopefully deliver this strategy at least over the next year. And then we will review, we will reflect as we go forward. So that's a little run through what has happened this year, some of the things that we've been thinking about, and some of the strategic points that we're also looking at to deliver over the next year or so. So I will hand back to Ian and then back to Jim for the financials.
Thank you, James. There's quite a lot in there. And as you rightly said, the strategy that you, draft strategy that you presented is still to be ratified by the board. The board has been discussing this for some considerable time, so I don't envisage there will be any significant changes, but clearly once the board has ratified the strategy, it will be published in due course for all members to view and to be aware of. I'm now going to hand over to our non-exec director who has responsibility for finance, Jim Monteith. to present a brief financial update.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Monteith, and I've been a non-executive director of SIBA since last September. As Ian, our chair, mentioned earlier, the last 15 months have been very difficult for the brewing industry, and SIBA's finances have reflected some of that. You should be able to see from the slide that's going up our profit and loss for last year. Good. You'll see revenue fell 39%, down to 7 million, reflecting the lockdowns across the UK. Our overheads were accordingly reduced by 185,000, which reflected the reduction in activity and the furloughing of most of our staff. This meant that the loss for last year has been contained to only 27,000 against a 3k loss for the previous year. Moving on to the balance sheet, you'll see slide 2. You can see from this slide that our reserves have reduced to 785,000, and this is kept in the form of just over 400,000 in an investment portfolio and the balance in cash. So SIBA remains in a very strong financial position. Turning to the current financial performance, this year we had an approved forecast for a loss of 120,000. Currently, we're expecting this to reduce to about 80,000 as we've received some government grants and also we've furloughed more staff. The SIBA board are currently considering a new 3-year plan in line with the new strategic plan, and we're looking to arrange a 500,000 CBIL facility, and we are looking to reduce our investment portfolio as we reduce our substantial reserves. I would reiterate, SIBA remains in a very strong financial position, and it's in that position so it can use some of its reserves in these difficult times. So thank you all, and I'll now hand you back to Ian, our chair.
Thank you, Jim. As I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, it's not possible to have any live questions, but there is the Q&A facility on your screen. I'm going to suggest is that if anybody's got any questions or comments on Jim's financial presentation, that we will take those at the end of the meeting under the Q&A session. So moving on, I'm now delighted to be able to welcome Kate Nichols, who is Chief Executive of UK Hospitality. UK Hospitality is the authoritative voice for over 730 companies operating around 85,000 venues in the wider hospitality sector that employed 3.2 million people pre-COVID. As Chief Executive, Kate speaks on behalf of businesses from all aspects of hospitality, coffee shops, hotels, pubs, restaurants, and many more. Kate has been widely quoted during COVID in the press and in the media, and clearly has a significant voice with government. So I'd like to welcome Kate.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, for that warm welcome and those kind words. And thank you for inviting me to join you here today at the AGM. I should say, over the course of the last 15 months, we've worked really closely with SIBA as part of the One Voice coalition of interests that we brought together. And I think, James's point at the end of his presentation about having that one voice, being the authoritative voice for a subsector, but having that authoritative one voice for the trade as a whole has stood us in good stead as we've gone through the crisis, notwithstanding the fact that obviously we haven't achieved everything that we would want to. So I'm really delighted to be able to join you here today. What I've got is probably just sort of some introductory remarks, and then I know you want to take questions and answers, and I'm happy to answer questions that come through on the chat. I just thought it would be helpful to sort of reflect on the impact of COVID, the last 15 months on hospitality and the knock-on effect that's had on our supply chain. Then look at the steps that we're midway through at the moment, the campaigning that we're engaged on with SIBA and others to be able to get the sector back on its feet, and then project ahead to the strategic recovery and the points that we're looking at there. So just picking up on the point about COVID, clearly, you don't need me to tell you how devastating this year has been, but I always think it's helpful when we start to talk about this impact to start with the positives. Where were we at December 2019 before we went into COVID, before those sort of first signs of the impact of what it was going to mean on the sector as a whole hit at the end of January 2020? Because actually that's where our ambition should be to get back to, and to get back to quickly. And that sort of frames the comments that I'm going to make. So December 2019, hospitality and the breadth of hospitality that Ian described that we represent, we probably cover about 95% of core hospitality in our membership: pubs, bars, restaurants, late night venues, hotels, holiday accommodation. But we go into those newer venues that were in growth, so grab and go, fast casual, coffee shops that were expanding outside of their core market. And we also go into visitor attractions and the hospitality that's there, and most importantly, contract catering, both public sector but also event catering. So that was the sector that was the only sector of the economy in growth, actually. At the end of December 2019, we will forecast 5% year-on-year growth for each of the next 3 to 5 years. We had a £130 billion industry, so bigger than automotive, pharmaceuticals and aerospace put together. And actually creating UK hospitality 2.5 years ago and putting that sort of set of stats together was, I think, critical for us to be able to get the leverage that we got early on with the government by putting us in the context of those other big industries that were affected. So 130 billion. And about 40 billion of that was direct export earning. So people always tend to forget that tourism and hospitality is our third largest export earner in the UK. Foreign visitors coming over to the UK spend more in our pubs, bars and restaurants, eating and drinking out, than all of our food and drink exports put together. And it's something that has been a disconnect across government, but it's something that we've been able to identify for them over the course of COVID, both our export earning potential as hospitality operators, but also as a literal showcase for those in the manufacturing side in food and drink who are looking to export. As Ian said, 3.2 million people working in the sector directly, a further 1.5 million working in our supply chain. So that positive ecosystem around it. 11% of employment, 7% of GDP, and £1 in every 3 that went over the tills in hospitality at the end of 2019, going back to the exchequer in the form of taxes. £40 billion worth of tax spend, which is the equivalent of the entire social care budget or the Brexit divorce bill, whichever way you look at it. And then equally importantly, each and every year since the financial crash, the last big seismic event that had hit the industry, we generated 1 in 6 of net new jobs, and we'd invested £10 billion in the high street. So a critical partner for government locally, nationally, and at the heart of many communities, over and above what we all know and love as the sort of pub at the heart of the community. Devastating impact of COVID over the last 15 months, 10 months of which all of our businesses have been closed without any revenue coming in whatsoever. For some of them in the late night sector, event sector, they've been closed for the full 15 months and subject to severe restrictions for the remainder. We haven't broken even other than 1 week last summer, which coincided with Eat Out to Help Out in the August bank holiday. So you've got 15 months of loss-making business, £280 million a day lost by the hospitality sector each and every week that they were trading with restrictions. Sales down 87 billion pounds. So the hospitality sector is now just a third the size it was when we went into that pandemic. We have managed to stave off most of the redundancies, but the headcount is 660,000 lower. So that positive contribution overturned, and starting the year really at the lowest ebb with closure numbers. At the full year of COVID, we lost 12,000 outlets. Although there's a lot of focus on wet-led pubs, quite rightly, and community pubs, the actual hit has been taken far more by our town and city centre venues and our restaurants. And importantly for SIBA members and for independent breweries, those were the ones that were picking up and starting to have the more vibrant drink-led offer, particularly around cans, bottles, and a big, vibrant, independent push into the fast casual and the high street market. So 12,000 venues, as a sort of minus 6-7% contraction in the market, but we lost 1 in 10 of our restaurants, 1 in 5 of our fast casual high street brands in the marketplace. That's not the sort of grab and go McDonald's. It is the sort of casual dining on the high street, the revolution that we've seen over the last 10 years. That's where we've seen the biggest hit in venue numbers. 1 in 10 hotels and a sort of 6% contraction in the pub market. The pub market protected largely because a lot of rent support was given by the pub companies throughout that period of time. And rent is the single biggest issue that's causing the problem. So starting that year at the lowest ebb with that devastating impact on businesses and the overall sector and employment within the sector, working collectively on a Build Back Better strategy to feed into the new business council that the government has set up, on which we do have hospitality representation and engagement. A sort of slightly contrite government, actually, I think, at the start of this year, realizing that they got things badly wrong with curfew, the Scotch egg disasters, this tier system. The industry, as James rightly said, being scapegoated and bearing the brunt of the restrictions. Government wanting to start to work with us to look at how we could build back better and to get hospitality back on its feet and contributing in the way the government wanted to towards economic recovery. And I think it's quite clear we've been closed for much longer than the government would have liked and anticipated, but a very clear message from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister and the new Business Secretary when they came in at the beginning of the year that they wanted to rapidly move on from COVID, from Brexit. They wanted to deliver jobs, growth and investment at pace across all parts of the country, particularly in those parts of the country that were red wall or that were more deprived, as part of their levelling up agenda. So we worked very clearly to set out a 3-point plan as to how hospitality and the supporting supply chain could help deliver the government's objectives. First and foremost, it was about reopening, that clear staged exit strategy linked to the vaccine rollout, with a commitment that there would be no return to the devastating impact of lockdowns, and a clear understanding from government about how much lockdowns had cost our sector, with the destruction of product and the costs of closing and opening taking its toll, with not being covered by the grants. And importantly as well, and particularly so when we're coming to the last knockings, when we're on that 4-step programme, making sure that government were aware that it was not just about the dates for reopening, it was the conditions under which we reopened that were the most important part, and that we needed to have the easing of restrictions. Open is not the same as open profitably, and that's something that we struggled with for the whole of last year to get lots of politicians to understand, and I still don't feel as though I've got through to everybody yet, but I keep plugging away. You can be open, you can be busy, you can be full, and you are making a loss, and until you lift all of those restrictions from our sector, we won't start to turn a profit until July, we won't start to break even until July, and until you get hospitality restarting and making a profit, you can't have the investment going back up the supply chain to support all of those other vital businesses that are part of the ecosystem. So clearly still a lot of work to do. We are at the most uncertain period again over the last week, 2 weeks, where we're looking ahead to the 21st of June, but you've got to stay relentlessly optimistic, continuing to push that the time is right to lift those restrictions, to move forward, to allow the industry to start to trade its way out of this crisis and to rebuild. So we're continuing to push on that. Second part of the strategy was about rebuilding shattered balance sheets, particularly for the hospitality businesses that we represent, but also always conscious of the fact that we were nothing without our supply chain. So if you leave the supply chain alone, if you don't help the supply chain through this too, we won't be able to provide any products to our customers. We won't be able to get restarted fully. So we talked to the government and put forward a lot of proposals that are still ongoing. A lot came to fruition during the budget itself. So VAT, retaining the lower rate of VAT for hospitality and continuing to push for that fairer taxation system across all products. either through VAT or through that differential duty rate, as James was outlining, business rate support, additional grants, and pushing to get the supply chain recognised and prioritised in the local authority grant scheme for the first time. So you do have reference in that discretionary grant system of our supply chain that needs to be recovered. And then finally, it's about the future recovery and putting in place the strands that we would need, not just to get reopened, but bridging towards that recovery period. 50% of hospitality businesses estimating that if the restrictions are lifted on the 21st of June, we will go back into recovery mode and we will be back to sort of pre-COVID levels of revenue, if not profitability. 50% of them saying by the end of this year, 25% of them by H1 of next year, and then the remainder looking at H2. And that's particularly those that are town and city centre dependent, looking at the offices that are not coming back, the international travel not coming back, real problems that we've got in our major town and city centres until we can get that restarted. So messages there that we're taking to government, and particularly around those shattered balance sheets, continuing to press in the short and immediate term for an extension of those business rate holidays, which end on the 1st of July. So quite critical, but also tackling the rent problems that we know are endemic across the sector, particularly again in the town and city centres that are hardest hit, and those restaurants and casual dining brands that we talked about, but also within the breweries, and particularly then looking at recapitalisation. We know that we've survived, although lots of people have survived the black swan of COVID, but we aren't out of the woods yet. You've got that grey rhinoceros of debt, which will continue to run alongside the industry for the next 18 months, 2 years, and could yet topple over a number of businesses. So it's about making sure that those support mechanisms are there for long enough. And then the final part of it is about resilience, building back resilience and having a longer term plan. We've been working with the government both on a tourism recovery plan and a hospitality strategy recovery to look at the sort of short term, sort of, post reopening, 6 months, 18 months, 3 years, to look at that longer term plan for how we can recover and get back to pre-COVID levels of revenue. For the tourism recovery plan, our objective is to work with government to get that a year ahead of where the external forecasts are. And for tourism, external forecasts for domestic tourism is recovery by the end of 2022, for international by the end of 2023. So trying to push government to bring those dates forward by a year, and to put in place the proposals and the supportive fiscal and regulatory regime to allow that to happen. So that does provide a really strong platform for us to go back and lobby and talk to the government collectively about a number of the issues that James was talking about. From a hospitality perspective, it's about grasping the nettles of the long-term issues that have bedeviled the industry. So root and branch reform of rates, root and branch reform of Landlord and Tenant Act, making those two fit for purpose. The former hasn't been adjusted since 1988, when we didn't have computers or mobile phones, let alone online shopping. Landlord and tenant is sort of 1940s, 1950s. Planning and licensing updates to build in some of the flexibility that we've enjoyed over the course of the COVID crisis and recovery, and a rebalancing of the corporation and business tax regimes so that we can make sure we're incentivizing people to consume product in responsible licensed venues, and that we can support the innovative, agile, dynamic parts of the sector. And then a big piece, I think, around the workforce, career of choice. I think everybody anticipated we would be back into labour shortages because we were pre-COVID. I mean, that was just a fact of life with full employment. We all anticipated we would be back to labour shortages, and continuing to talk to the government about migration policy, apprenticeships, T-levels, career service, and promotion of hospitality as a career of choice. Probably by 2022, didn't anticipate that it would hit so hard. We have got acute shortages. The current vacancy rate is at 9%, which is double what it was pre-COVID. We've got 188,000 fewer workers in the sector that we are looking to recruit. So that is a big challenge that we're looking at going forward. And again, we'll need that help from government to look at that, addressing that in the short, medium and longer term structurally. And then I do believe if we get those messages right, if we get those platforms right, we come out with the tourism recovery plan with that ambition of recovering more quickly. We have the hospitality strategy for recovery, again, more quickly, and looking at the conditions for building into resilience into hospitality and the supply chain. That gives us a really strong platform for pushing back on some of those issues that James was outlining that are so crucial to the supply chain, what things that government are going to do to us rather than with us. Deposit returns, sustainability, obesity strategy, calorie labelling of alcohol products, all of those kind of issues where our objectives and governments are not aligned. We will be able to use these strategies to be able to talk to them progressively and sensibly about a pragmatic solution. The speed of change, the pace of change, the cost of change, we can start to talk about how they recover that. And then I do believe if we get those mechanisms right, if we have those plans in place that I just described, that we have the ambition to be able to deliver, then we will go back to doing what we do best in hospitality and support through the supply chain, generating 1 in 6 of net new jobs, turning back into that profitable generator of economic growth and tax take, and also investing in our local community. And we have a perfect platform to build on now, where government recognises the strategic importance of the sector and its associated supply chains. And we have the platforms coming up that can demonstrate on the global stage how important we are to brand Britain culturally, socially, and economically with the G7, COP26, D20, and then next year's Commonwealth Games. So I think, you know, we have a great opportunity, although we are at the moment of maximum uncertainty and we are still clinging on for survival. We do have that optimistic future to be able to look forward to, and a government who's willing to work with us, not always apparent at the time, but is trying to work with us to be able to help us to recover and to contribute back to UK PLC. And I'll pause at that point in case there are any other questions.
Thank you very much, Kate. We're running slightly behind time due to the outage of various internet services that we've all experienced this morning. There is an opportunity, a limited opportunity for people to put questions via the chat box, but whilst I'm waiting to see if anybody wants to put any points forward to Kate, I'd just like to ask Kate, have you any comment on the Times report this morning that the 21st of June looks like being delayed for 2 weeks?
It's an interesting headline, that one, because if you actually read the report underneath it, it says nothing different to what we've all been told for the last 2 or 3 weeks, which is it's too early. Ministers are still making up their minds. I think the Times report itself says it could be. That's one of the options that government is looking at, but the headline says it will be. The official government line that I get from every minister is we are still making up our mind. This week will be critical. We are looking at the data. We remain cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to press ahead. We know and understand how important it is. So I think, you know, today's announcements, today's press reports are continued speculation in that vein, which we had over the course of this weekend and last weekend. I just have to keep focused on plugging away at the argument that we need this to be lifted. We are not profitable. We are not viable without this being lifted. It might sound a simple thing to say 2 more weeks, hang on for 2 more weeks. Who in the audience would believe the government that it is just 2 more weeks? Because I can't see what metric is going to change dramatically over 2 weeks to allow full reopening. But B, you know, I can't see that there is a need to remain closed. So you know, I think at the same time, sitting alongside that, we know government is looking at all of the social distancing measures that could be taken off or could be kept on. So I think the debate is less around 2 weeks delay to an arbitrary date and more around what conditions might we have longer term in society, in the community. But we just have to keep plugging away with that simple message. We are not viable as a sector if you postpone this for 2 weeks.
Thank you. And I agree with you entirely. I think it's fascinating to watch the pressures that the Prime Minister is coming under from all sides. And I totally agree with you that not only are most hospitality businesses unviable in the present state, but clearly those of us in the supply chain also feel exactly the same. So I think we're all 100% behind you in having I guess many of us are envious that we get, the voice which you have with government, and we wish you all the very best in continuing to get those messages across.
Thank you. Well, can I just say that my voice is your voice. So, you know, we've worked really hard to try and get hospitality up onto the top table. You used to have 5 big business organizations that would go and see the Chancellor. You've got manufacturing, which is, as a collective, I suppose it encompasses brewing, financial services, retail. We've now got hospitality, and I always make sure that when I do go in there, I am talking on behalf of the whole sector and the whole of the supply chain. And they do get it that unless we get hospitality moving, you've also got knock-on effects on our manufacturing sector and the export earning potential that you've got there. So I do always try and make sure I represent everybody within the sector, and our One Voice coalition brings that to the fore and makes sure that we're sort of aligned. And I think James and I have probably been joined at the hip over the last 15 months to make sure that those messages go through.
Thank you. I do actually have one question now, which has come through from Richard Naseby at Milton Brewery, which is, do you get the impression that if there is a delay, there will be further government help, or will we be left to fend for ourselves?
I get the impression that there will be additional government help, which is partly the strongest driver that we've got for getting them to stick to the roadmap, because Rishi does not want to get out his checkbook at this point in the cycle. We've made it very clear that there is no way you can leave the sector high and dry if we haven't got trading properly from the 21st of June. All of the government support runs out on the 1st of July. The business secretary, on a call that James and I were on, was very clear that if the roadmap wasn't stuck to, you'd need to revisit the support mechanisms. Now, whether that's direct grants or not, I don't know. I think that's an area where brewers may well be in a slightly better situation than hospitality venues if there is that slight delay, because there's the local authority grants that go on for much longer, the discretionary grants, and there would be more call on that. And there's a new tranche of money that comes out on the 1st of July. There is also, they have to spend their money from before the 30th of June in order to qualify for the next tranche. So if you've had something refused, go back in and badger your local authority. If they don't spend to the max, they won't get money from the 1st of July. So try again. But the business secretary was clear. If there was a delay, we would need support.
Thank you. And there's one final point. It's more of a statement than a question, but it's from Anthony Hughes at Lincoln Green Brewery. Superb statement from Kate and UK Hospitality. Given the restrictions imposed on hospitality and as a result on UK brewing, isn't there an argument that the government should be supporting these sectors by paying off a proportion of the loans that have had to be taken out? Pre-pandemic, many were debt-free and have had to take out loans just to survive. Hardly seems fair. I'm sure you would agree with that statement.
Totally agree. We've put that to them as part of the hospitality strategy recovery and the tourism recovery strategy. It's one of the strands that we'll be looking at as you build back resilience. How do you recapitalise the sector?
Thank you very much, Kate. We're going to have to move on now. I really appreciate the time you've taken to join us this morning. If anybody else has any questions moving forwards, then we will put them to you via Neil, and we'll ensure that any brewers are answered. But thank you very much indeed. Okay, so now we move on to the second of our resolutions, which again you can see on your screen on the left-hand side. It's Resolution 2 from Scotland. Gerald Michaluk is going to propose the motion. Again, as I said earlier, if anybody has anything they'd like to contribute to the debate, then please do so via the Q&A box on your screen, and I will read out those contributions. So I'd like to hand over to Gerald now to propose Resolution 2.
You have a copy of my own live, I suppose. Yeah, no. You've seen Resolution 2. It should be on your screen. What we're really looking at is SIBA's done an excellent job in supporting and lobbying, but we've got many more challenges facing the industry. We already heard about government reviews, the big boys pushing us at one end. We've got the COVID crisis at the other end. And the last part of the problem, I think, is the fact that we've got to watch the government legislation. There's a very large lobbying body that is against drinking and against, therefore, brewing. And these people have managed to get really good positions in government. And not just have they had one opportunity, but they've gone to the regions and they're able to introduce legislation selectively through some of the regions. And that means that, for example, in Scotland, we've had legislation. We've certainly got a government here that is very anti-drink. And we as brewers seem to be getting a lot of the brunt of that. Whenever there's a problem with drinking, we still see people drinking beer. When they talk about COVID problems, they show people drinking beer in bars, etc. So this lobbying has to be throughout the United Kingdom. We can't just concentrate on London. We have to look at Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland as well, to make sure that nothing is introduced that then the government of that region is going to say was working wonderfully and therefore should be related to the whole of the UK. With the likes of the bottle return scheme, we're going to land up with potentially 4 different schemes with 4 different badges on them, which is going to mean that us trying to sell beer around the country is going to be severely restricted if we have to have a different badge for every bit of the country we want to go into. Not to mention the damage it's going to do to the industry per se. So we've got a real issue here all round in that we need to be able to lobby not just centrally in London, which is important, of course, but we need to watch every one of the regional governments and make sure that nothing is introduced by them that will likewise be unchallenged, or none of these lobbying groups are able to convince a certain minister that this is a vote-winning strategy for them, introducing something that would detrimental the section. So what I'm wanting to say is, can we rely on SIBA to continue to spread resources around the UK to make sure that our point of view is expressed to all these regional governments as well as the national government?
Thank you, Gerald, very much for that. I should have introduced you as Gerald Mickellup from Arran Brewery. I am not at the minute seeing anything in the chat box from members who wish to contribute to this debate. We have a seconder of this resolution, which is Christy Slater from Loch Leven Brewery, and he is currently on a train, so I have a statement from him, which I gave him the option of either formally seconding the motion and summing up, or, but I'm going to, as I'm not getting any response through the Q&A box, I'm going to read that out, and if I still didn't have any response, I'm going to go straight to a vote. So Christy Slater from Loch Leven Brewery, in seconding this resolution, says, as each of the 4 nations across the UK seek to drive their own agendas and timelines, it seems likely that some elements of future legislation derived from devolved powers rather than from the UK central government may inadvertently affect our ability to trade seamlessly across the internal UK borders. A current example of this is the Scottish Government's decision to launch its DRS scheme ahead of the UK. In the short term, this will make trading between Scotland and the rest of the UK more complex and expensive, but could potentially also have a permanent impact once the rest of the UK introduces its own system, which is unlikely to be identical to the Scottish one. It is, I believe, not unreasonable to assume that similar future legislation could be adopted by different members of the 4 UK nations, which would similarly affect our ability to trade across the internal borders within the UK. Whilst it might not be in SIBA's power to ensure that there is a consistent approach across the UK in all cases, our aspiration should be to keep a watchful eye on proposed changes, highlight potential issues, influence where we can to minimise any conflicts, and protect the interests of our members. I would therefore ask that you support this resolution. I am not receiving any intent to speak, so could I ask that we move straight to a vote, please? Thank you very much for that. I should have the results very shortly of the voting. I'd like to apologise again for the outage of just over half an hour that we had earlier. As we now know, this was entirely due to external internet failure, way beyond the control of SIBA or our partners. I am not seeing the results of this vote. Here I am now. Just bear with me, please. Yes, there were 56 votes for and 1 vote against the Scottish resolution, which is clearly carried. So thank you, Gerald and Christy. I'd just like to remind everybody again that this AGM and conference is very kindly sponsored by our SIBA associate members, Natfin Solicitors, whose generosity is much appreciated. And now I'd like to move on to introduce Henok Fenty. I hope I pronounced that right, Henok, who is the brewer and co-founder of Anipolo in Sweden. Anipolo was founded as a collaboration between Henok, who is a long-time home brewer turned pro, and Carl Garandin, an artist and co-founder of the popular Cheap Monday clothing brand. They are known for pushing the boundaries of what constitutes beer, with bottlings like their Bianca double peanut butter jelly Lasse Goes, providing a mouthful in more ways than one. So welcome, Henok.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. You got my name right, but the brewery I would pronounce Omnipollo, but that's I'll say it a couple of more times. Thank you again for having me. True honor. I'm nothing but a humble home brewer who's decided to try to go pro, and I'm yet to take that leap fully. We're right in the middle of a process of building our first commercial brewery about 11 years in. So it's always learning and trying to get new perspectives. This is a really fun thing. I did uni in England. I have a pretty good grasp of what you drink when you don't have any money in London for a couple of years. But I'm yet to come back to England and do a tour, given how many new breweries and amazing things that are happening over there, and the rich brewing culture, which you've always had over the past couple of years, have really kind of taken off in a real way in many different segments as well. I've divided this short speech into 4 different chapters. I'll quickly just introduce Omnipollo. For those who don't know, I'm Henok Fenty. I work with the beer side of what we do. And then there's a graphic designer side to our company, and his name is Carl Grandin. And we met back in 2010, right when I was about to launch our first product. And that's kind of how I will kick this thing off, because the first hard part of my journey, at least, was the realization that you can't just brew beer, you also have to sell the beer, which I think we've been quite adamant at trying to keep as a part of our company culture since we started about 11 years ago. The idea of Omnipollo kind of sprung out of a need to try to bridge the gap between what we call craft beer and craft beer, if you will. Tongue-in-cheek expression. And I think it's partly due to the fact that I worked for a pub chain in Sweden that catered to people who were interested in better beer. So we would have 20 draft lines, whereas at that time, and when especially this pub chain was incepted in '93, was a quite rare thing. You would have 3 to 5, maybe even less taps in a regular pub, but they were very adamant that they were going to show a breadth of what beer could be. The problem was I was in my 20s and my friends wanted to go to nightclubs. So I would have to force them to come to the pub to drink good beer, while in fact, I was quite convinced that they'd rather be in other places. And so the idea of trying to create a brand that could combine the two, so try to kind of take the leap into a broader segment of the restaurant industry in Stockholm, was kind of how the idea of Omnipollo came to life. We are currently brewing at 6 breweries around the world, and we sell the beer that we brew in roughly 40 to 45 countries. We try to sell as much as possible locally where it's brewed, but it's not always so easy. Some beers, like the one you mentioned, the peanut butter, this and that beers, they kind of tend to travel a little bit further because you need to find like-minded people in 45 countries as opposed to 1. So those are seldom consumed locally. We've recently taken on our biggest investment to date, 4 million euros in a church, where we're building a brewery that kind of tries to embody something that we've had as a part of our ethos since day one, which is quirky recipes but strict process. So we've worked with German equipment provider Braucon to build a kind of high-tech Willy Wonka factory in this church that we're excited about really testing out. We're about 6 to 7 batches in, which makes it only a baby so far. But we're happy with the quality, and we're humbly realizing how tough the job of running a brewery is, and kind of getting in touch with people we've worked with for 10 years and saying, why didn't you tell me how hard it was, and so on and so forth. So chapter 1 for us was, we had no experience when we started this company. I'd brewed for about a year at home, and it was very clear to me that I wasn't going to start out building a brick and mortar brewery simply because we didn't have the money, but also because we didn't know whether we would have any talent in this field. I therefore got in touch with a brewer that I respect highly, that we work a lot with these days as well, a guy called Dirk Notz. He runs an operation outside of Ghent in Brussels, which was the place where I was living at the time, called The Proof. And The Proof specializes in working with contract brewers, which we've been from the start, and to a large degree still are, although we also have our own brewery now. And it was very much love at first sight, in the sense that I was a very rare specimen in his world for a brew character, just showing up there. I think I was a bit younger than most of the people he worked with before, and I had a couple of other attributes that I think he thought was kind of fun to explore. We released our first beer in 2010, 2011, and it was a champagne yeast fermented blonde ale, lightly hopped with some American hops to get some fruity character out of it. And I think we thought it was the perfect beer to kind of bridge that gap between our lager drinking friends and our craft beer drinking friends. I quickly became aware of the fact that I needed to sell the beer when I got the first invoice from the brewery. And that's something that I think has followed through, because the meeting with Carl Gundin was very instrumental in where Omnipollo has gone, and probably to the fact that we've managed to stay alive for 11 years, just having something that looks different from what's other things look like on the shelf. And I think that kind of idea that constantly trying to drag it towards a more pop cultural expression in what we were doing was very much our DNA from kind of the first day. Chapter 2 then, contract brewing. I think contrary to what common understanding of what contract brewing is, it actually takes a lot of time. It took us 3 years before we could lift a dime from the business, which, by the way, also meant we had to have a full-time day job. I was still working for this pub chain and a PR bureau for a short while after that, having small kids at home. It was a tough gig, and kind of for the longest of time, very much a hobby. And I think that it's been good and bad, in the sense that those 3 years really set the tone for which direction we would be going with our beers. If it's a hobby, you're also ready to risk a bit more. You're not as dependent on paycheck month to month, while at the same time it kind of grew to a size where it was completely unsustainable to try to do both a 9-to-5 job and trying to build something of a bigger size with the employees and so on and so forth. So what do we have to do to kind of get there? And I think that for us, having the idea, realizing quickly that it's a low margin, high volume game, also meant that we were, if we were going to try to affect one or the other, either the margin or the volume, we had to either try to think a value add, in the sense that it had to be something unique that we were bringing to the table, which kind of naturally pushed us in a direction, I would like to say, of making quite quirky, different-minded beers. And it was a nice kind of start, but I think we've entered another phase in chapter 3, which I'm gonna just quickly touch upon. We built a church for this specific reason that we couldn't brew a pale ale at the end. It was kind of too bland for us to do something like that and try to sell it in 45 countries. And it's, as a drinker, I love drinking pale ales, I love drinking lagers. We're very much, occupied with the idea of furthering ourselves as craftsmen, and that's what our next chapter is about, really. And I think that it's been again, both in a humbling way, realizing how hard it is to run a brewery, also very rejuvenating to see, a tank of 80 hectoliters being sold out, quickly, simply because it's brewed in a church locally in Stockholm and being served fresh. I think that's really the power of this movement, and kind of what I'm assuming a lot of my peers in the industry have gone through as well, kind of realizing that this really has like a built-in value add, that we are brewing beer at a smaller scale, but I think locality has really sailed up as an important part, and to be fair, a luxury we couldn't afford when we kicked this thing off, just based on the fact that it's a quite sizable investment, physical brewery. We've kind of gone the opposite direction, I think, than a lot of other bigger players than ourselves have. Working with, I'm just going to mention again, BrauCon has been amazing. I'm plugging some advertisement here. You you are an influential crowd, and probably by brewery equipment yourself. It's been absolutely incredible. I think it's a once in a lifetime experience for me to have something so custom made that they've managed to do for us. And yeah, working with something in Europe has very, very cool, and really a different experience from what I've had with brewing before. The fourth chapter for us, I think we've all had a pretty interesting year, a tough year in many aspects. We also run a couple of restaurants, bars. We have 5 today, and they've all been affected by Corona and COVID. This year has been really a very, very special year, I think, for everybody again. For us, we've managed to keep those 5 that we have today. We had to sell one off. We're looking to sell another one off. I think we're coming out of this, on the one hand, with the realization that we really, anything can happen at any moment. And I think that in March 2020, if you would have asked me, I would have been afraid and worried about the entire industry as such. Doomsday's coming, bars and restaurants are closing, all of our friends are going to have to close their breweries. I have not seen that happening to the extent that I feared, and I'm really happy to kind of see things lighten up. Granted, I'm in Sweden, which means we have a different trajectory than the UK has at the moment, perhaps, but I still have a very strong sense that lighter times are coming ahead. And I think that I hope that the channels that we've built and our peers with us, namely you, are going to be sustained over time. For example, our web business grew significantly last year, whereas our draft business obviously shrunk to 0. In a perfect world, some of the web business will still be around once this is over, whereas we can kind of try to rebuild the draft business going forward. I think that's what I wrote down, and I would like to thank myself and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Henrik. You're actually slightly ahead of time, so don't worry too much. As I said earlier, there is an opportunity by the Q&A box to ask any questions of Henrik, or anything, indeed any questions from any of the previous speakers. I just have one, and I'm sure James has another. I mean, my question to you is, given that we knew as early as 12 months ago that Sweden was working on a different pandemic trajectory to the United Kingdom, and at the time there were a lot of commentators who were arguing in the UK that the Swedish approach was a better one. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts with hindsight as to whether it was or it wasn't.
That's a really good question. I think Sweden has had a different approach from the rest of the world. You're being like diplomatic there, saying from the UK. I mean, that's really hard to say. I mean, right now we're at a place where almost 50% have had their first shot, which is, that's it's moving pretty quickly. My dad had his first shot a month ago, and they're moving down by age, and I just got offered mine. So it's, I'm thinking within the next couple of weeks, we'll be more or less fully covered in terms of the first shot. The numbers are low, but we have, in my understanding, had more deaths per capita than a lot of other countries overall. And I mean, that to me speaks to the fact that this might not have been an incredibly successful strategy. That said, I think that Sweden has overall had a more open attitude to Corona, and therefore a less rough 18 months. And what that does to society, I can't speak for, but I've sure enjoyed, since I split my time between Ethiopia and Sweden, I've sure enjoyed being back in Sweden, where I can have my kids in school, for example, as opposed to Ethiopia, where we've had to homeschool for almost a year's time. So it's it all has its ups and downs.
Thank you. I'm going to ask James to pose a question to you.
Thank you, Ian. I mean, just to say, I'm a big fan of Sweden. I was in Sweden in September, so just as the UK was sort of climbing out of its restrictions and feeling like a very unfree country, I paid a visit to Sweden, and it was a very, very refreshing thing indeed. I did a beer trip to Malmo a couple of years ago as well, which was really, really cool. And I'm a huge admirer of the Swedish beer scene. I think there's lots that we can learn from you guys. My question really is, how far do you think you can push these crazy styles? What might be next? You know, is there a limit to the number of adjectives and the number of verbs that you can squeeze onto a label?
That's a really good question, James. There was a time where I was kind of like, I was worried that I was going to run out of creative juice, if you will. You know, we've been traveling quite heavily to make collaboration beers. And I looked at my calendar, I think it was like end of 2017, and we had like 20 collaboration beers coming up over the next year. And I just like, my job was to slot in what these beers were going to be. And when you do it in one go, which kind of sort of came from the idea of being more organized and planning ahead, and it's very obvious that you're following certain patterns, and you're kind of like, you know, repeating yourself in that creative process. So I think my answer to your question would be, you know, out of 20 or 30 or 40 years we make every year, we're lucky if one of them kind of pushes the boundary from where we've been before. But I do think though that like just by continuing to just try to push the boundaries, there are those like once in a while kind of occasions. Either you happen to work with a brewer that has a completely different perspective from you, or you find an ingredient that you just realize, wow, you know, this would be kind of cool in beer. That's sort of done though. Like I realized like there's no ingredient that hasn't gone into beer, but it has to be kind of another angle on it. I don't think there's an end to it, to be honest. Like music, just like continue to evolve with it. We're at a point now where we're kind of like doing it the opposite, in the sense that there are a lot of basic things that we haven't realized about beer making that we're now catching up on by having our own brewery. And I think that's like as an intellectual challenge, that's super rewarding for me personally. But yeah, sky's the limit.
Thank you very much, Henrik. The last question from me. When you spend a lot of time coming up with these amazing off the wall beers, what's your go-to beer style though, when you just want to chill and have a normal drink?
I mean, it's the risk of sounding a bit boring. I think that as many brewers having kind of palate fatigued out on a lot of very flavorful beers, we're very into pilsners at the moment, and we've also dedicated quite large amount of space for that in our own brewery, and I think that that's something that I would definitely reach for if when not thinking about it. Other than that, I'm very into hops as well, so I drink a lot of hoppy beers. And you know, I love every beer style. I can actually just go through each and every one of them and say I love this and I love this and I love it. But I think right now, if you were to kind of have a pint with me, it would probably be something in the Pilsner vein, you know, or a cask beer actually. Like, you know, just thought of going to a pub in England and having a cask after this pandemic makes me joyous.
Cask is back, so we should back cask.
Yeah.
I agree with you entirely. I mean, the difficulty I always have when people ask me what my favourite beer is, my response is, depends on the time of day, depends on my mood, depends on what I might have eaten or be about to eat. And I think that's a very sensible answer. Thank you very much again for joining us. I'm not picking up anything, whether that's because there's a failure of communication or not, I don't know. I'm not picking up any questions. But we really appreciate you joining us this morning and sharing your thoughts. If anybody is listening to this and has tried to put a question through the system to Henna, we will ensure that it gets there via Neil or Barry. But again, many thanks, and I will now move on to the final bit, which is a formal Q&A session. I'm advised there's nothing coming in at present. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes just to make sure that we don't want to cut anybody off who does have some point they wish to make. I'd just like, again, to thank our sponsors, Naptons, who've been really helpful in enabling this to go ahead. I'd like, again, to apologise for the outage that we had for, I think, about 40 minutes, which, as we now know, was due to a major internet failure. I'm still not seeing anything coming through. James, is there anything you'd like to add in conclusion?
No, just other than to say, really, you know, we have had, as kind of Kate referred to earlier, we have had a hell of a year, and I expect, whilst there's certainly a lot of hope and a lot of optimism going forward, there's going to be significant challenges in the year ahead as well. The debt, the shape of the market, the competition from global brewers. I want to be positive. I always try to be a positive person, but if we've had a hell of a year, the year ahead might still be pretty tricky. So we all need to pull together, get behind your trade association, join, encourage people to join up, and only that way we have a fighting chance, really.
Thanks, James, and I would very much echo that message. I'm also a positive person. I think we just need to dust ourselves down and put it all behind us and get on with it. And thankfully, as James points out, the majority of independent brewers have managed to survive in the UK. I'm sure I can speak for all of us in that it has not been a pleasant time, and we've often searched ourselves to wonder how on earth we're going to get through it, but most of us have, and I'm confident that I'm actually confident that government understands that small business in particular has had it really hard in the last 15 months. And I am optimistic that due to the efforts that SIBA makes and the likes of Kate Nichols with UK Hospitality, I am optimistic that we will see some concessions from government over the next 12 months. I'm not pretending it will be easy. I'm sure they'll be hard won, but I am optimistic for the future. I'd like to therefore formally close our 2021 virtual AGM and conference. We look forward to seeing everybody again in Liverpool next March. It will not be me chairing SIBA at that time, but I will definitely be in Liverpool and look forward to meeting everybody in person once again. Thank you very much.